Well, thank you so much. It's a real joy to be able to be here and to talk about the clocks of the cloister. And of course, we're talking about the Ephrata Cloister. If you're not familiar with that, I'll give about a 1-minute introduction to Ephrata. It was a community that was formed in 1732 when a man named Conrad Beisel moved to the banks of the Cocalico Creek in northern Lancaster County, a very isolated area where there really was nothing but woods and wildlife. And very shortly after he moved there, a group of people came to be with him. They had heard about him, and in the process they began clearing the land and creating what is today the Ephrata Cloister. By about 1750, the cloister had grown to the point where they had about 300 members, and that is both celibate members, men and women, and also married couples as well. They also had built about 40 buildings at that point, and they had become very self-sufficient in many ways. They provided for themselves. They did a lot of farming. They had 5 mills that they owned and operated, 2 printing presses. They also did beautiful artwork and fractal work, and they created some outstanding music as well. All of this is something that they became well known for. The one thing that was also part of their life, but not as well publicized, was their clockmaking industry. We had 7 clockmakers who were members of the cloister. They began around the year 1770 to make their own clock movements, and they continued till about 1820. 5 of those members were part of one extended family, the Gorgas family. Nearly 20 years before the clockmakers began working there, however, the brothers, the celibate brothers, were making clock cases in their wood shop. We don't know how many for sure. We know of at least 3, but I'm sure there were more than that. And this began starting in 1753. Today at the Ephrata Cloister, we have 4 tall case clocks on display. All of them have roots at Ephrata. All 4 of them. The cases were made there at Ephrata, but the 4th one, we'll talk about that one a little bit later. I think it is important to understand that everything at Ephrata was simple. This was a religious community, and they focused on the spiritual. They downplayed the physical, and everything was plain and simple. This is especially true with their furniture, and of course that translates as well into their clock cases. None of the cases that I'm aware of that were made by the brothers had any hood columns or quarter columns. They were typically flat tops, although we do know of one that was an arch top. So let's take a look at some of the cases. This is the first one. This is the oldest one. It's called the Herker's clock, or sometimes referred to as the Faunestock clock. It dates to 1753. That year, one of the members of the cloister returned to Germany to try to recruit new members. And while he was there, he bought the movement for this clock from a German clockmaker in Krefeld known as Herker. He brought the movement back with him to Ephrata, and the brothers built the case for it. Now, it's a beautiful case. In fact, it seems a little advanced for the brothers, at least the hood does, and there is some speculation that the hood came with the movement from Germany. We do not know if that's the case or not. I will say the wood matches perfectly with the rest of the case, and the rest of the case was clearly made by the brothers. And I say that because they made a fatal error to making the case. The waist was too narrow for the pendulum to swing back and forth. Well, in typical Ephrata style, they solved that in a very practical way by cutting out holes along the side and covering it with blocks of wood. It made it just wide enough for that pendulum to swing effectively. They call this cutout ears. And so when I'm giving tours at the cloister and we come across this clock, I often will say, be careful what you say in this room. The clock has ears and is listening. Next, we have a clock that was made in 1770 or thereabouts. It is believed to have been a movement made by John George Hoff Sr. of Lancaster, who was not a member of the cloister. He actually moved to Lancaster in 1769, just 1 year before this was made. We don't know for sure if it was a Hoff movement, but it seems to be. It's a 30-hour movement, and you'll notice the case was made by the brothers to house the movement. It has no hood columns, no quarter columns on the waist or the base. It's a flat top bonnet, extremely plain and simple, made of pine wood, painted according to the catalog information at Ephrata, a very dark blue. To my look, it is black. It also has a plain rectangular pendulum door with iron hinges and 2 weights that are hung on a later rope. The dial for this is an iron dial, painted black. It has open cast brass spandrels. It has a small square hole near the top, below the calendar, below the chapter ring and above the hands, which is where the calendar was displayed. The chapter ring is made of pewter, and really this is very typical of the kind of work at Ephrata in terms of the cases. The third clock is found in the bakery at Ephrata. This is a more attractive case, to be sure. It's 83.75 inches high. It's a 30-hour movement. It, too, was made by John George Hoff Sr., and the movement is believed to be in working condition, but since it's a daily wind, and we're not there every day, so we can't keep it running. It has a nice arched tombstone pendulum door, double weights suspended on chains. This too, as I said, has a movement by John George Hoff Sr. It's dated 1775 to 1780, a square dial made of iron painted red, which is typical of many of Hoff's clocks. The same cast spandrels which Hoff was known for. It is said that he would buy these spandrels by the cases and use them on his clocks. The chapter ring again is pewter, engraved with the numerals. It also has, it was made out of walnut wood. It's very attractive, actually. While this case does lack hood columns and quarter columns, at the same time, the brothers did do something which was pretty unusual for them. They put scalloped edges on the hood, which really makes it pretty attractive. So these are the 3 that we know the cases were made by the brothers at Ephrata. There probably were more. We just are not aware of them. We're going to look now at some of the clockmakers. As I said before, there were 7 of them and 5 in one larger family. And they all worked beginning in 1768 until 1820. The first that we're going to look at is Jacob Gorgas of Ephrata. Jacob Gorgas was the son of John Gorgas of Germantown, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. John himself was a renowned clockmaker in the Philadelphia area, and it is believed that he taught clockmaking to his brother-in-law, the famous David Rittenhouse that we heard about yesterday. Jacob and his wife moved to Ephrata sometime in the mid-1760s. He first appears on the tax records of Lancaster County as a clockmaker in 1769. It is believed that he made about 200 clocks or so. He was very prolific at this. He was also known to be a joiner, which leads some people to believe that maybe he made at least some of his own clock cases. As you can see here, this particular case is entirely different from the kinds of cases that the brothers made in their wood shop. This example is dated 1770 to 1780, although I believe it's really more towards the earlier end of that spectrum. It's a walnut case featuring floral carved rosettes. It has urns and flamed finials and stands 101 and 1/4 inch tall. This has an 8-day movement, the iron dial. It also has a painted scene on the top in the arch there, which is attractive. Separate second-hand dial and a calendar wheel as well. This clock sold here in Lancaster County in 2015 for $7,500. This is a 30-hour flat top made again by Jacob Gorgas of Ephrata. Again, it's a walnut case. It has turn columns on the bonnet, a moon dial, nicely shaped pendulum door as well. This is a 30-hour movement which Rory sent me. It is in the collection here at the museum, and this is by Jacob Gorgas. You'll notice that it uses the rectangular pillars on the column, on the plates. It has open pinions, the closed crutch fork, which was typical of Jacob Gorgas. It uses the anchor recoil escapement and the pendulum cock suspension, all typical of Gorgas. This is the same movement shown from the rear. Now this clock, I think, is a fabulous clock by Jacob Gorgas. It's dated about 1770, although there is some speculation it might be as late as 1780. This is in the collection of the Historical Society at the Cocalico Valley in Ephrata. In fact, it's right across the street from where it was made. Gorgas lived right next door to what is now the Historical Society. This case, I think, is a true masterpiece. It's an 8-day movement. I was not given access to that movement, so I do not have any photos of that in particular. But this was made for Gorgas's brother-in-law, William Deschamps. And I'm not sure it shows up too well, but instead of putting his name, Jacob Gorgas, on the dial, he put William Deschamps' name on there to honor him. And you'll also notice just below the cornice on the waist, at the top of the pendulum door, he engraved the initials WD for William Deschamps. Very attractive. Now this is another 8-day movement by Jacob Gorgas, dated 1771. It uses the anchor recoil escapement, the closed crutch fork, grooved drums, rack and snail striking with rack hook locking. Has the 4 plate pillars which extend through the front plate to hold the dial in place. Notice the 30-hour movement that I showed earlier had the square or rectangular plate pillars. This one does not. It has the rounded type. But do you see what's missing on this movement? There's no stem holding the bell. This is a little unusual for Lancaster County, or at least for Ephrata. The bell is mounted inside the hood, and it is activated by a chain link, which I've outlined there in red on the left, and then I made it larger on the right to hopefully be able to see that. I've never seen that before in any of the Ephrata clocks. Next, we're going to go to John Belzner. Now, Belzner was not in Ephrata very long. He actually had most of his career in Baltimore, Maryland. After his wife died around 1780, he moved to Ephrata in 1781, joined the cloister, and lived there until he died in 1785. He did make a few clocks while he was in Ephrata. He also taught clockmaking to some people. His movements were considered good. His cases, not so much. The cases were extremely plain and simple. As you see, the one on the left, in fact, it has led speculation that perhaps the brothers at the cloister made the cases for him. There's nothing particularly special about it. It's nice, but not out of the ordinary. Now, the case on the right is different. That's because it is a Belzner movement, but it was found in a replacement case that was made around 1900 or so. And that has led some people to think that perhaps the original case, again, was not substantial, or the owner at that time simply didn't like it, and so they put it in another case. Here we have a 30-hour movement by Belzner. He uses the anchor recoil escapement, closed crutch, with a thread loop iron pendulum suspension. Belzner always seemed to use that thread loop. Again, he has the square-shaped or rectangular-shaped iron pillars, repeat on demand, rack and snail striking with the rack hook locking. Next up, we have a clock by Solomon Gorgas. Solomon was the son of Jacob. He too was a member of the cloister, and he is the only clockmaker from Ephrata that we have a portrait of. And that portrait hangs in the visitor's center at the Ephrata Cloister. Solomon worked with his father for a few years and took over the family business when his father died in 1798. However, he was not as committed to clockmaking as his father was. He had many other interests as well, including running a general store and a tavern, and he was a member of the Pennsylvania State Legislature. This led him to move from Ephrata to Cumberland County in 1804. But this case is an attractive case. It has side windows, 4 columns on the hood, and it has some nice hearts engraved around the cornice of the waist. Solomon also had a brother named Joseph who was a clockmaker, but he was even less committed to that task, it seems like. He did run a sawmill, and like Solomon, he moved away from Ephrata in 1805. His clocks are considered rare, and I do not have a photo of any of them. This is the 8-day brass movement by Solomon Gorgas, dated around 1800. It has the anchor recoil escapement and the closed crutch fork, grooved drums, and tailed ratchet wheel clicks. The brass plate pillars are extend through the plate once again to carry the dial. You'll also notice that the pillars are of a later style. And one feature that's somewhat different on this is that the hammer for the bell is particularly narrow compared to many other ones. Next up, we come to Jacob Gorgas of Hinkletown. And this has been a source of confusion at times. He's often referred to as Jacob Gorgas Jr., but that's really not accurate, and he never took that title. He is actually the nephew of the other Jacob Gorgas, not his son. Jacob Gorgas of Hinkletown grew up at the Ephrata Cloister. His father was actually a celibate brother there until 1760, and then he moved to Roxborough outside of Philadelphia, and he married Juliana Anderson and began raising a family there. However, the father, Joseph, died in 1766. So the widowed wife and children moved to Ephrata, and she raised her children there. By 1786, Jacob began making some clocks at the cloister. He continued that until 1791, renting housing from the cloister community, which was not all that uncommon by that point in time, because the celibates were beginning to diminish in number at that point. He then bought a farm not too far from Ephrata, just about 4 miles to the east near the little village of Hinkletown, and that's where he really took off with his clockmaking career. This is a very nice flat-top cherry case, dated about 1795. It too is on display at the Historical Society of the Cocalico Valley. This is a 30-hour movement by Jacob of Hinkletown. He used the anchor recoil escapement, the closed crutch fork, much like his uncle and cousin. However, he also had open-ended pinions like they did as well. But typical for this Gorgas, he used the thread loop pendulum suspension, and he also typically removed the arch from the bottom of both plates. This is another clock by Jacob Gorgas of Hinkletown. This is a real beauty, in my opinion, a nice federal case made of cherry wood with walnut highlights. This clock has all of its original parts, or at least it did. It was still running until just recently, and it is now actually in the shop of Will LePond, who is working on it, and I think is going to have to replace a few minor parts in it to keep it running. This clock is dated 1813, and you'll notice it has 4 hands operating off of one shaft, the hour, the minute, the second hand, and the calendar hand as well. This clock had belonged to the same family, the Levan family in Lancaster County, since day one, until a few years ago when it was sold, and it's now owned by a good friend of mine in Ephrata. So it is still in Lancaster County. Here are 2 views of the movement. It's an 8-day movement. One view from the right, one from the left. In many ways, this is typical of the younger Gorgas, with one difference. On this one, he did not remove the arch at the bottom of the plates. No explanation as to why that is. Next up, we come to Benjamin Gorgas. Benjamin was the brother of Jacob of Hinkletown, so therefore he also grew up on the grounds of the cloister. He never left the cloister, however. He was listed as a clockmaker only for a few years during the time while Jacob, his brother, was also making clocks in Ephrata from 1786 to 1791. When Jacob bought the farm and moved closer to Hinkletown, Benjamin appears to have stopped making clocks at that point and instead began working in the paper mill at Ephrata. Now, full disclosure, I do not know for a fact that this clock was made by Benjamin Gorgas. Family tradition says that it was, but it cannot be proven. In fact, we don't know of any clocks made by Benjamin Gorgas. This one stands 86 3/4 inches high. It still runs very well, and it's been in the same family since day one, and it still is. This clock is an attractive case. It's very similar, in fact, to the flat top that we saw earlier by his brother Jacob. But the movement is very different. This movement has the deadbeat escapement. It's the only one I know of that might be associated with Ephrata that has a deadbeat escapement. It also has an open crutch fork. And it only has 3 plate pillars, which is not by any means unique, but out of the norm for most of the Ephrata clockmakers. It does have a repeat on-demand rack and snail striking with the rack hook locking. The chain and the hands are replacements, but the rest is believed to be original. This brings us then to Abel Witwer. And I'm so glad that we are able to talk about Witwer. We only know of 4 clocks that were made by Abel Witwer, but they are said to be very fine pieces. I'm going to show you 2 of them. All of his clocks that we know of were 30-hour movements, and he signed his name on the dial every time, which was a little unusual for a 30-hour movement. Witwer always used the 3 plate pillars, which is interesting considering the one that we think might be a Benjamin Gorgas one was also had 3 plate pillars, and Benjamin and Abel were both members of the cloister. They were contemporaries, and they knew each other quite well. It does make one wonder if perhaps there was some crossover between them. Witwer also numbered all of his movements. In addition to being a clockmaker, Abel Witwer was known to be a joiner, and may have made his own clock cases. We don't know for sure. This particular one is on display at the Historical Society of the Cocalico Valley, and as you see, it's very plain, a simple flat top with no hood columns, no quarter columns, but it does have fluted corners on the waist. I don't know what the wood is, and I probably should check with Alan Anderson on that. It looks to me like it might be chestnut, but I really do not know for sure. There is some slight damage to the dial in the upper right portion of the arch, and there's also a sizable chip in the wood on the lower right corner of the hood door. This is another Abel Witwer clock. This is in the collection of the Ephrata Cloister. It's dated 1801, made of cherry wood. It has 1 single finial centrally located in the broken arch pediment. The brass movement is typical of Witwer. This is the one that's at the cloister. It has the anchor recoil escapement, closed crutch fork, a tailless ratchet click, repeat on demand rack and snail striking. And it also has the iron pendulum suspension cock. This movement is numbered 4 by Witwer. Now I thought I'd throw this in here. This is considered to be the clockmaker's cottage at Ephrata. It still stands. It is where Abel Whitwer made his clocks and lived. The portion that's darker on the left is the original building. In fact, that part of the cabin was made in 1735. It is the oldest of the original buildings that remain at the cloister, just 3 years after Conrad Beissel moved there. The white part was added about 50 years later, presumably to be the workshop for Abel Whitwer. Now, very quickly, I'd like to look at the tower clock. The cloister did have a tower clock that was dated 1735. No, it was not made at the cloister by any means. In fact, it was made by Christopher Witt, the famous clockmaker in Philadelphia. The gears are made of brass, and these are two views of it from the left and from the right. The movement has an iron and brass pendulum that's 42.5 inches long. Unfortunately, I don't have a photo of that. The weights are of cast iron and attached to the brass movement by a heavy cord. This is also a picture of the front end of that tower clock. Here we have 3 different dials that were used with the tower clock over the years. You'll notice it only has one hand, the hour hand. That's all the people at Ephrata were concerned about. Everything functioned on the hour, and they did not need a minute hand. The tower clock originally stood in the meeting house on Zion Hill. When the community built a new schoolhouse in 1837, the tower clock was moved to it, and the white building on the left is the academy or the schoolhouse. At some point in the early 20th century, the tower clock was moved to the former sister's house, or the Sarin, which is pictured here in the photograph or in the painting on the right. When the tower clock was moved to the academy, they decided to put a new bell in it as well. This is the bell that was placed in it, and it was made by John Wilbank, the famous bell maker in Philadelphia, who also made the replacement for the Liberty Bell. Now, to be sure, many of the buildings at Ephrata are long gone. The members of this religious sect are also gone, but many of their products remain, such as the fractal artwork, their music, many of their furniture pieces, and many of the books and other items that were printed in the print shop. And we also have this clockmaking heritage. Today, many of these wonderful clocks continue to mark the passage of time and change. Thank you very much for your time and attention.